Well, hello again, everybody. I'm Leslie Burkus. I'm the Executive Director of the Urban and Community Forestry Society. You are here for our monthly learning series, and we're really happy to have you here for a great one about diversity, tree diversity within our communities. And what does that really mean? On its surface, you probably have an answer right away. Lots of different types of trees. But we're going to hear more from Dr. Chris Riley, about what that really means and how you can implement that within your community. So if you've been here before, you know I like to do a brief introduction and then we will kick it over to our speaker. So I'm going to go through a few slides now. And as we get started, I want to thank our exclusive learning series partner, Bartlett Tree Experts. Together with Bartlett, we share the goal of raising the bar for urban and community forestry and arboriculture. And we'll hear more from Nick Martin here in just a second, more about how they're working with us to do just that. And we thank all of our sponsors that make this possible. And most of all, we thank you as members. This is a membership society, and you are who make this possible. So if you are a member, we thank you. You are here joined together with people from across the globe that are experiencing the same things. Tree difficulties, when to put a tree in, when to take it out, dealing with homeowners, all the things that go into making trees grow in communities. And so joining together, you learn more. If you aren't a member, we really hope that you'll join us and take a look at our website and join when the time is right. So again, brief introduction, and then we'll hear from Dr. Chris Riley, and he will help us define what does it really mean to have diversification within our urban landscape, and then the key ecological drivers behind diversification efforts. What's pushing us? What's making us need to get to that? You probably know some of those, including climate change and a changing climate, but he'll go into that in more depth. And then now that we know that, how do you guide those changes within your communities? We'll hear about all those things and then have time for Q&A at the end. And this is approved for one ISA CEU. We will put that form in the chat at the end of this, so stick around till the end if you want your ISA CEU. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted after this. As we get started here, please drop your name and where you're from in the chat. We'd love to see and hear from folks across the globe that are joining us, so let us know where you're joining from. So as we get started, this is the Urban and Community Forestry Society, or UCFS, and our job is to build the confidence, competence, and camaraderie of all professionals who manage trees and forests to create and sustain a more livable community. So if we break that down more, what we really mean is that we are the professional membership home for the people who make or support a daily tree care decision. If you decide who, what, where, when, or how a tree goes in the ground, you should be part of the society. And I like to say that if doctors, nurses, and lawyers have societies, tree people do too. And the goal is to bring you together and speak on your behalf. So there's power in that. There's power in bringing people together. And that's why we're here, to help to support you and all the work you're doing. And we do that through a variety of things. I won't go through all of this, but this is the list of the things that we do, the programming, the offerings that we could put out to members like you. So our City Trees publication, Arborist Exchange, our accreditation program we're about to launch later this year, and you'll hear a lot more about that, is setting the standards for urban forestry programs and what they need to achieve to hit high standards, and then giving them that seal of approval once they hit that. And then, of course, our monthly learning series. A couple of quick things to point out on that list is our conference, which is coming right up here in November. Registration is open now. We'll be in Henderson, Nevada, and we really would love to have you there. Be with your tree people. This is the time to network and learn from one another at a conference setting and leave rejuvenated, because you will be with your tree people and it'll be so nice to be with them. So we hope to see you at the conference. And then coming up in 2 short days is our Municipal Forestry Institute application process. So if you haven't heard of Municipal Forestry Institute, this is our leadership training for urban foresters, utility foresters, nonprofit folk, anybody who's making one of those daily tree care decisions. And it's not proper arboriculture, it's not pest and disease. While we certainly talk about that while we're there, it's how do you decide what kind of leader you want to be from whatever seat you are in? How do you understand the context in where you're working? And how do you bring those together to make a real change happen for the trees in your community and the people who depend on them? So applications are due on Friday. So if you want to go take a look at that and see if it's the right thing, we are going to be at that beautiful hotel right on the beach at Jekyll Island. So we hope to see you there. And I won't go through this whole list, but we keep the learning series coming for you, especially thanks to our partners at Bartlett. So take a look at our events page. Carla will drop that in the chat, and we hope to see you at another learning series here soon. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Nick Martin, Vice President of Consulting with Bartlett, to share a little bit more about our partnership.
Yes, thanks, Leslie and Carla. Good to see everyone. Appreciate everyone joining. Yes, we feel very fortunate that we've been able to partner with UCFS this past year on the learning series. So we at Bartlett are obviously rooted in science and education, and this seemed like a great partnership to be able to hopefully reach a larger audience with everyone in the urban environment as well. So it's been a great partnership so far, and we really appreciate that. And part of that is I have the honor today to introduce Dr. Chris Riley. So Dr. Riley is a scientist with broad interests centered around the intersection of plants, pests, pathogens, and people, focused largely in urban landscapes. So based in the Washington, D.C. area, he serves as the Mid-Atlantic research scientist for Bartlett Tree Research Laboratory. So Chris is passionate about conducting and disseminating research on current issues impacting urban forestry and arboriculture, training and supporting Bartlett arborists, and communicating with broader audiences on the fundamentals of science-based tree and landscape care. Additionally, Chris leads a joint research partnership with the Washington, D.C. based nonprofit Casey Trees, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, in exploring topics aimed at growing and preserving the tree canopy across the nation's capital. He holds a BS in environmental science and policy from the University of Maryland and a PhD in entomology from the Ohio State University. So I want to say thank you to Dr. Riley for joining today, and I will pass it over to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you, UCFS, for kind of creating this opportunity to talk about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, something I've spent the better part of the last decade researching, this really interesting connection between biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and ecosystem services. And I appreciate Leslie's nod. I know this is a topic that will probably not be brand new to most people on this call, which is great, but my hope is that we can dig a little bit deeper and find some other areas where this might, the topics we're covering today might be, applicable to what you all are working with in your normal day-to-day operations. So I will go ahead and get rolling here. And I will say, I love when we get to have these types of presentations in person. It's a great opportunity to kind of see where everyone is coming at this from today. So I like to pose this question, and then usually what I'll do is make people uncomfortably talk to their neighbor, make a new friend. And it gives me an opportunity to showcase this cool little feature I developed in PowerPoint where I can basically make a timer appear across the slide. Just a cool little neat way to get this going. Obviously, we can't do that as well in a virtual setting there. So we'll go ahead and skip that and pretend we had a really nice spirited discussion about what we think of when we think about diversity in the context of the landscape or the urban forest. And I'll use those terms interchangeably. I'm not so focused on exactly the system per se, but more of just this broader urban ecological system that a lot of us end up operating in. So I think, we'd all kind of arrive at the conclusion that we have a good intuitive sense of what a more diverse system looks like. So we could all probably guess, yep, we have higher diversity over here. We have lower diversity on the right side of the screen. And with that, we might even have value judgments that form something like, hey, this is good, this is bad. For a number of different reasons there. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you, but my goal in the next 30, 40 minutes or so, or however long I have, is to maybe explore these ideas with a little bit more nuance and see where we can get a little bit of a better understanding for just what diversity actually entails in these really interesting systems we get to work in every day. So the goal for the next 30 minutes or so, I have four kind of main objectives. First, to talk about what is landscape diversification? How do we make sense of it? We'll talk about some of the key drivers behind efforts to have a more diversified landscape. I'll mention a couple different hurdles that I've experienced in terms of bridging the gap between, what's being produced, usually from nursery growers and the like, and then ultimately what gets consumed and how that drives some of our forest communities. And then I'll talk about, with whatever time I have left at that point, at least one strategy for enhancing plant biodiversity in urban landscape. So that's kind of the flow that we'll be going with. We'll see what we can get to. I'll say this too, I'll leave my email at the end. I'm happy to continue this conversation. So if there's parts of this that you like or you want to dive deeper, please feel free to take notes, reach out, and happy to talk more about it. All right, so let's go ahead and begin with this kind of central idea that, when we think about landscape diversity, there's a multitude of different dimensions surrounding it. And so we'll start off with one that's probably the most familiar to everybody on the call. It's probably the most familiar to the general public at large, and that is this idea of taxonomic diversity. So thinking about different species, genera, families, so on and so forth. It's one of the most intuitive. It's how we kind of organize biological life. And so it makes sense that this would be a primary area that we think about in terms of diversity within our forest setting, right? So again, very intuitive. It just so happens plants have lots of different shapes, structures, forms, and we can get a good sense of, yep, this plant on the left is a little bit more diverse relative to the community on the right. Now, this can sometimes be a bit of a challenge as it relates to the human component of it, because there are many people, I can think of my parents, who would probably prefer the landscape like the one on the right. So we have to mesh sort of our understanding of the diversity of these spaces with the humans that oftentimes inhabit and use these spaces. This is as good as any to introduce a concept or at least touch on one that I'm, again, sure many people are familiar with as we try to make sense of, what level of diversity is perhaps enough. So this is Frank Sanamore's 10-20-30 rule, a very general rule, not really founded in kind of hard empirical data, but more of a general rule of thumb for how you should set benchmarks when it relates to taxonomic diversity. So in this case, the recommendation, no more than 10% of a single tree species, 20% in a genus, 30% in a family. And really, this was designed and suggested with the goal of preventing that catastrophic failure that can happen when a new pest or an existing pest comes in and has the potential to wipe out an entire group of trees here. So no commentary at this point on is this adequate, the value of this per se, but I think the reality is, and I think we all deal with it, that there are plenty of cases where these types of benchmarks are, nowhere near being met. So as a tool to kind of guide us in ways that we should head towards, as far as taxonomic diversity goes, I think they're a really good jumping off point. But that's just one aspect in my mind of how we can conceptualize landscape diversity. So I love showing this photo. It's, I think, one of the more famous ones, I would say, in the where the pests meet the trees type of world. It's a great photo from one of my committee members, Dan Herms. It's not showing, a row of trees spring and in the winter. This is, before and after. And I'm sure many of you have seen this, but this is before and after the introduction, unfortunately, of emerald ash borer. And so depending on where you are in the country, this may be very familiar to you. It may just be something you've heard about. But we can use EAB as an example, not unique in the sense that as a country, we deal with tons and tons of examples of non-native pests and diseases that come in, spread, absolutely fantastically across multiple states, multiple, ecotypes, and cause tremendous amounts of problems. So where EAB has been and spread, it has pretty much wiped out most of our native ash populations. Causing, as you can imagine, pretty significant disturbances to forest communities, but not all trees, right? Not all trees perished or have seemed to perish in the wake of this, really small beetle causing such devastation. And what folks have found over time is that there are these pockets of trees, these individual trees that have seemed to persist. Now, some of that could be the environment they're in, but it also seems like there's a genetic component. And so we begin to kind of understand the importance of genetic diversity as a component of broader landscape diversity, something that may be hard to visualize, harder to manage for, but can have a really important effect when it comes to having a diversified community and a resilient community. And this shows up too when we think about where we're sourcing trees and diversity and lack thereof on the production side of things. So we'll hit on that a little bit more as we keep going there. So we have taxonomic, genetic diversity. This is one of the ones that I think deserves more and more interest. And I think as an industry, we're moving more towards considering the role here. But again, if we were in person, I'd ask if anyone knows the story of Stumpy, this little forlorn cherry tree that was on the tidal basin. I don't believe it's still there anymore. But as a DC native, we love our cherry trees. We love what they do in the city every spring. And, that's great from a people standpoint. But if you imagine that these cherry trees are an important food source, right? If you're a pollinator, you have to visit these, you might be kind of bummed that this whole resource shows up and goes away at one point in the growing season. It's not really diverse in terms of what it's offering. So we can begin to think about bloom time as an example of trait diversity. And I really like this example. It's a great visual coming from more of the entomological side, but this idea of incorporating diversified floral resources to sustain pollinators in apple orchards. So if we look at the chart here, apples have key flowering times around April to May, but that doesn't really cover the entirety of the growing season. So we can think about how our community might have different traits corresponding to different functions that might support specific goals that we have in mind. And we can think about this in the context of trees more specifically. This is a really nice paper that came out just this year in Urban Forestry and Urban Greening, where these individuals, these authors highlight some of the different traits that they're interested in with different urban trees they're looking at. So if we look at an example here, dispersal mode, growth rate, mean longevity, mean seed size, so on and so forth, these different traits can then be organized into functions. So in this case, the function might be influencing how species establish and persist in the urban environment. And from that, we can begin to generate things like functional diversity, both metrics, indices, indicators of functional diversity within a community here. So, and someone who gives a lot of these types of presentations, it's amazing when there are these graphics that really drive the point home. And so in this paper here, these authors kind of group these different species by some of the common characteristics that would then result in key functional traits or functional groups. And as you can see, there's not always a perfect relationship between the number of species, right, that taxonomic diversity, and the number of functional groups that might be represented there. So, given those differences, those discrepancies, you can have relatively simple communities that are relatively functionally diverse. Alternatively, you can have communities that are incredibly diverse, but maybe low in functional diversity because they all kind of do similar things or occupy similar ecological niches in that landscape. So this gives us one other way that we can conceptualize diversity, again, tying in very heavily with the taxonomic component, but then thinking about the role that these individual organisms have within our forests and our landscapes. So those are three aspects. There's a bunch more I'm going to kind of breeze through here. One that I think is incredibly important is this idea of structural complexity. This is one that entomologists in this space are incredibly interested in because a lot of times the structural complexity of a habitat can be really important in predicting how it might serve as a conservation space, how it might support, say, natural enemies who function in pest regulation. But as a good comparison here, we have, your kind of sad crepe myrtle. It's got great canopy, but there's very little vegetational complexity within a space. There's no understory, no herbaceous cover, no overstory. And that is just in juxtaposition with here we have a crepe myrtle way more embedded in a vegetative community. So we have what looks like a pine overstory, maybe some herbaceous ground cover, maybe some junipers down below. And so how do we begin to think about the complexity within that three-dimensional space and what that might mean for the ecological dynamics that are at play there? Again, highlighting this within the context of an urban setting, you have your very common trees planted along a tree lawn or a planting strip, and that's compared with a little bit more structural complexity in this image here on the right, having significant impacts on the ultimate ecology of these different environments. We can keep talking. We can talk about age class diversity. So if you come from a silvicultural background, this is probably very intuitive to you. You can probably see some parallels here where the uneven age stand actually, by definition, will have greater structural complexity, even for all the same species. But just knowing that there's differences in pest susceptibility, insect susceptibility, how tolerant you are of abiotic conditions across the life of an individual, and where it might make sense to have a more diversified age class where possible. We can talk about management diversity. This makes a lot of sense in the context of grasslands. I know we're focusing more so on trees, but some of the same concepts apply where, it rarely is a matter of, hey, let's mow everything at once or let's mow, not mow for the entire season. As it stands, usually a lot of times having a diverse approach to something like mowing, your turf grass can actually contribute to having a broader conservation component to it, right? Because you're effectively contributing to having more varieties of habitats in this space. And so we can think about similar types of dynamics when it relates to tree management, type efforts, where can we diversify our approach to management, because that may be fostering or leading to differences in habitat, differences in environments for different ecological processes to unfold. And the very last one I'll hit on, again, I love to ask people what comes to mind when they think of this. Don't focus on the area, but we have an increasingly great ability to utilize aerial imagery and to better understand processes that are happening on the ground based on how landscapes are shaped and configured. And so, as you can imagine in this landscape here, if you're a tree or an ecological community out here on the bottom, you might behave very differently from what you have up here on the top. And so, with the kind of rampant ease of accessing some of these pretty useful data products, we can begin to understand how land use or land cover diversity might influence processes down on the ground level. It's not always easy to do this, and it's not always easy to manipulate this. But for those individuals who work with broader habitats, where they may be able to think about how these factors can drive, at larger spatial scales, the dynamics happening at smaller ones, these are things worth thinking about. And at the risk of going too far off the deep end, I know someone had asked a question about this, but with that type of data, you can then begin to think about how it's not just, do I have a lot of tree cover, but where is that tree cover located? And how does it form these ecological structures that might be conducive to bird migration, that might support pollinator movement through an urban habitat? So this gets more involved very quickly, but again, the idea is that there's more to diversity than just what species do we have. There's actually a lot of different wrinkles to the puzzle here. And so it behooves us all as folks who manage these ecosystems to think about how these different components play a role in structuring the processes and the functions that we're trying to manage too. So when I think of diversity in the context of the landscape or an urban forest, my sort of simplified definition here is that a diverse landscape is really one with more variety across scales than a simplified one. Those could be spatial scales, they could even be temporal scales, but we're really thinking about a greater variety. And in that variety, we can see a lot of potential benefits to the system that we're talking about there. So that covers a little bit of our introduction on what are some of the different components. I want to shift gears now and talk a little bit about some of the benefits in approaching diversification. And again, I think we would probably have a really spirited debate on things that we already know, associate with potential benefits here. I'm going to talk about two of the big ones that I perceive. And I really want to emphasize, I have in italics here this word potential. We as readers would have sort of this unified framework or relationship where we know that as diversity of a system increases, it will always correspond with these known benefits. And I think after maybe about 50 years of research in this biodiversity ecosystem function space, we have a good mechanistic understandings in a lot of places, but diversity doesn't always lead to better outcomes. And so a very kind of intuitive example right in front of us, if I asked you for which environment seemed more resilient, I think most people would probably point to the one on the right. But if I asked you which environment is better at supporting food production, having a monoculture that's really good at what it does may win in that regard. So we're going to paint with a bit of a broad brush here, but know that like everything in biology, there are always exceptions. It just depends on sort of the goal that we're outlining and the goal of why we might pursue diversification efforts to begin with. So when we talk about this, the number one reason that I like to highlight here, admittedly kind of a jargony sentence, but this idea that in a diversified system, we have greater resistance and greater resilience to disturbances and stressors. I get it. It's very jargony, but let's break it down. I think we all probably have a sense of what this might entail, but let's get through it here. So resistance and resilience. When we talk about this, I'm going to be focusing more so on these larger systems. So something like an urban forest, which is admittedly, I think we're well aware, a bit of a nebulous concept, but this is relative to or relevant to something as small as an individual tree or an individual group of trees. So across these different spatial scales, these ideas are going to hold up here. Now, when we think about what these systems do, right, we can think about the functions that they provide. And a really good, obvious one is, in this case, something like oxygen production. So we can think about photosynthesis. It's one of the most fundamental functions that, green tissue is going to be conducting. It doesn't really care whether or not it's doing it for our benefit as humans or not, but this is a function that plants undergo that results in oxygen production, that results in biomass production. So, these are functions at the most basic level. And what we want to do is try to maintain those at high levels, right? Again, whether it's an individual tree or a collection of them. So when we talk in a systems theory standpoint, a resistant system, if we look at disturbance A here and this blue line, we're not going to see a big dip in the production of that ecosystem function, right? Photosynthesis is going to continue despite that disturbance coming in here. And that's going to be compared with, in this case, point B, where we see a dramatic drop off in that service being provided or that function. So that's resistance, right? We want to resist those changes. Resilience, on the other hand, then is the ability to kind of bounce back quickly or see a very small change in the nature, the volume of that output of a service over time as a result of that disturbance or that stressor coming in. So in this case, we see at time point A, disturbance A, a really large drop in that function, right? In this case, we'll talk about photosynthesis. For disturbance B, we see a comparatively smaller drop. They both come back to the same level, but in this case, disturbance B, was done, and this would be considered a more resilient system. So to the extent that we as managers of larger spaces are able to influence outcomes, we want to design and develop systems that are going to be resistant to disturbance and highly resilient. So when they are disturbed, they bounce back as quickly as possible. And that has been shown that, oftentimes a more diverse system is at least more resilient. Again, mileage may vary on some of that resistance, but those are general trends that we see show up oftentimes within this ecological literature here. So that's one of the goals, that greater resistance, and that is to disturbances and stressors. So what do those entail? Leslie already mentioned it, but the two big ones that come to mind, I'm sure for everyone on this call. First one, climate change, the reality that we're living in a time and place where the environment continues to change, oftentimes in ways that are not as conducive to the well-being of existing flora in places where it has occurred for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's a little bit beyond the scope of this talk to do a deep dive into the climate change angle. However, I do want to give you all just one more tool that you might take and might utilize with folks that you communicate with. So this is one of my favorite ways to kind of visualize some of the effects of our changing environment. It comes from some research done by some scientists at the University of Maryland. And this is the reference to the paper, Contemporary Climatic Analogs for 540 North American Urban Areas in the late 21st Century. What I love about this is that they've created a really easy to utilize app highlighting just about all of these different locations. So I know we have folks calling in from all over the country. Chances are good that one of these cities has been modeled near where you're at. And as a millennial, I like to figure out how to get to something through Google. So I guarantee you, if you Google, what will my climate look like in 60 years, you'll be able to pull this application up pretty easily. But this is what it shows, right? So I'm using this for Gettysburg. Your mileage is going to vary depending on where you're looking at this from, but similar types of trends. So under high emission scenarios, what will Gettysburg feel like in 60 years? Oh, it's supposed to feel like, or it might be predicted to feel a lot like Bristol, Texas, where it's 10 degrees warmer, 21% wetter in the winter. Summers are about 11 degrees warmer and 5% wetter. Now, as people, we might be able to handle that. If you're born in Gettysburg, you live there for 60 years, right? It's going to be more uncomfortable. You might be able to handle that. But for trees that we plant, and gosh, we hope that a tree in a city is able to live 60 years or longer. Those are some of the most valuable trees. That's a really dramatic changing environment to have to cope with over the lifespan of the trees that you're planting today. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be exactly like that, right? These are predictions based on the best data that's available. But that's a pretty startling, distance to go over the lifespan of a tree over just about 6 decades there. So that's going to be a dramatic stressor. Those differences in the environment that's growing, that the trees are growing in. We can also think about not just the average change, but also some of these extremes. So again, I'm using Pennsylvania as an Ohio State grad. I have no love for Penn the state or the university. But that being said, I think this is a really helpful visual. And again, depending on where you're at, these trends may vary. But this idea that we're going to see greater changes in the extremes, right? These high temperature days, heat waves, also days where there's heavy precipitation. And so it's not just that on average things are going to change, but those extremes are going to change. And those are going to be continued drivers of stress over time for our urban forest populations. So that's a big one, climate change right there. The other big one that I'm particularly interested in as an entomologist is the role of introduced pests and diseases. So I'd love to ask who in the group knows what this little bugger here is. But given the medium we're in, this right here is Asian longhorn beetle. Fortunately, the story of this one has not been nearly as devastating as emerald ash borer. Both of these potentially highly devastating beetles. But this one has not spread nearly as far. And that is really fortunate because this one has a significantly broader host range than just emerald ash borer alone. So we see a number of different commonly planted urban species here. And what's interesting is when you think about individuals like this, the Asian longhorn beetle, suddenly that 10, 20, 30 rule becomes a little bit less useful because it may not just be one genus that's vulnerable. It may be several different genera that are susceptible. And we can't really guarantee what the next big thing is that will come through and wreak havoc on our urban and natural forest system. So we know there's been a long history of things coming in. Many of you probably heard my colleague, Dr. Matt Borden, talk about beech leaf disease in many parts of New England. In Ohio, we're seeing beech forests that look like this over here on the panel on the right. So letter I. But we can't know, right? We don't know what will come next, what will replace things. And so given that uncertainty and given what we know already, that many of the things that have come in, the insects, the diseases, have caused forest level changes, it really speaks to the value of focusing on having that greater resistance and resilience to those stresses. And to the extent that diversification can help with that, that's a really strong reason to pursue it. Just because, these things are not going anywhere. We're going to continue to see those types of stressors coming in and causing problems. So that's one of the big reasons to consider and approach diversification efforts. The other one is just this greater provision of ecosystem functions and services. So this gets kind of mechanism driven pretty quickly here, and we won't go through all of it, but again, functions, things that plants do because plants want to do them, things that organisms do because they want to do them. That's what an ecological function is in our interpretation here. And so services then are what have been kind of really in vogue, I would say, in the last several decades, this acute understanding of all the services that we get as people as a result of those functions carrying on and doing their thing. So here you see a number of functions really stemming all from plant, biomass development, photosynthesis, leading to a number of different services that we as people enjoy and benefit from. And I will say, just to touch that mechanism angle, the why behind greater diversity leading to some of these greater services, there's a number of mechanisms. One is the potential that, hey, by having a variety of different tree species or plant species, it's kind of a probability thing. You're increasing the likelihood that you're going to have species that perform really well in your site. And so the logical extension of that is, hey, if we know what species perform well, we're able to just select those and work on having those and maximize those benefits that we're obtaining. So there's limitations there, but some of it is purely mathematical, right? Do you increase probability of selection when you have a greater diversity? There's also been a lot of cool work done that gets to this idea of complementarity or niche partitioning. And so a lot of this arises from grassland research, but it speaks to this idea that when you have a diversity of plants that utilize different resources within a system, you have a greater ability to kind of consume those resources in their entirety. And so plants can kind of work within their own ecological niche, and that can contribute to a greater overall production of functions and services that we're going to benefit from. So it depends. The why behind it is a little bit variable. And there still needs to be more work to understand it. But as a general rule of thumb, there tends to be this relationship we see in many cases, not all, where as biodiversity increases, function increases, and we tend to see a greater provision of services like the ones you see here. So one effort to kind of investigate this, I'm just going to briefly highlight this, but I think it speaks to some of these dynamics we're looking at here. This is a book chapter published a few years back, and in it they cite one of the potential benefits of using biodiversity for pest suppression. So as an entomologist, this is something I love. This idea of, hey, if we add diversity to the system, we might reduce the likelihood of pest outbreaks from occurring. That's not just decrease the likelihood of the pest coming in and feeding on a plant, but also the likelihood of a pest outbreak, so an explosion of pests that may already be present. And if you spend a lot of time dealing with urban plant pests, you might be familiar, but generally what we see is in urban areas, including urban forests, we tend to see these greater outbreaks of plant pests, things like scale, aphids, spider mites, so on and so forth. And so being able to manage these while using biodiversity is a really intuitive angle right there. And so what my colleagues and I wanted to do is kind of examine this question with a little bit more meat on the bones here. And so we asked this question: are residential landscapes with greater woody plant diversity associated with fewer pest management interventions? This is a project that I started when I was still in grad school. Was really fortunate to get to work with Bartlett and Bartlett's data at the time. And so essentially what we did was combine, these inventories of the woody plant communities on residential properties along with IPM inspection data. So data where a trained specialist went out, evaluated the plant communities, looked, and based on thresholds associated with the client, with damage thresholds, they carried out treatments to manage those pests or disease problems. So we essentially looked at the relationship, right, between plant diversity and pest management interventions, right, which are oftentimes pesticide treatments. And what we found, which we were incredibly jazzed about, was this significant negative relationship between woody plant diversity and arthropod management interventions. And so that was consistent both at the species and the genus level. So in other words, what we found is that for properties that had this greater diversity of woody plants, they tended to have fewer pest management interventions. In other words, where we see more biodiversity, is it a reduction in pest outbreaks? Is it, lesser pests' ability to colonize the space? We don't have the exact mechanism, but this is kind of very much in line with what we predicted based on ecological theory and what's been done already looking at plant-pest interactions in some of these urban and managed settings. So kind of cool, kind of in line. And if that's interesting to you all, the paper is available here. We published it a couple of years ago, and I'm happy to share that with anyone that's interested. But it speaks to that overall idea that, where we have greater diversity, we may find ourselves having this greater provision of functions and services. Again, rich area for research. Doesn't, it's not a one size fits all sort of relationship, but it's one that we continue to see show up and is worthwhile in kind of pursuing diversification goals there. So two of the big reasons why I would encourage approaching diversification: one would think at this point we hit that was easy button. Next thing you know, our boring turf grass becomes a field of flowers. And obviously things are not so easy, particularly with woody plants, right, where it takes longer to drive some of these changes here. So with the time that I have left, which I know we're moving through this pretty quickly, but I want to highlight some of the challenges that I've been made aware of. I've had a chance to work with some other researchers, particularly Deb Hilbert, faculty member up at SUNY ESF, and Andrew Kozer, who's down at the University of Florida, as they've explored some of these questions of why do we hit species diversity bottlenecks. So not focusing on all aspects of plant diversity or system diversity, but really focusing on the species diversity angle, in part because that's one of the easier ones to look at. And so their approach is really focused on having some of these conversations between both producers, so growers, folks in the nursery industry, landscapers, and then those who would purchase plant material and install it. And so both of these papers, this is one that we have almost out the door in our arboriculture and urban forestry, focusing, the first one's in Florida, This one that we did together was in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. A lot of the dynamics are similar. So if your geographic area isn't represented, I can pretty well guarantee that a lot of these dynamics are pretty similar. And so what showed up in a number of these surveys and interviews is that, when it comes to some of these constraints or bottlenecks, a lot of the responses are pretty similar. They focus on things like regulations, planting site conditions, historical and cultural values of communities, tree sizes, tree availability, and client or resident desires. And if you break that down, you can look at it a little bit more quantitatively. So in this case, we're looking at factors influencing production, a strong focus here on demand and sales. And that makes sense, right? A lot of times growers are taking on a lot of risk when they grow a crop. They need to find who wants to buy it. And so that's a big motivating factor there. On the other side, those who are involved in decision makings about purchasing are really interested in things like site conditions and tree function. What is the site that this tree is going to go into? How is it going to function in this space? So you can see a little bit of divergence here, or at least a little bit of an opportunity for communication between these two different parties. How do we get aligned on what makes sense in the production and the consumption space? Also, some similarities when we look at constraints and opportunities for expanding selection. So in both cases, regulations seem to be one of the big bottlenecks. Regulations in terms of, hey, we're not able to plant X, Y, or Z. And that also creates opportunities for expansion. Where can we maybe broaden regulations to allow more opportunities for planting, A, B, C on top of that? They also, a reoccurring theme was kind of the importance of collaboration and education. So, I really appreciate the chance to come to a group like this and, maybe not share things that you all haven't thought about, but emphasize the importance of educating on how biodiversity in these systems really can be an important driver of important outcomes. And that collaboration piece is equally important. Where is there room to increase communication between all aspects of a tree's life, from growth to ultimately planting? And then with the company I work with Bartlett, also having folks who end up inheriting those trees and caring for them in many cases for the remainder of their life beyond planting. So there's a lot of opportunities here for collaboration, education. So these challenges don't seem insurmountable, but per usual, I think it involves getting people to the table to have discussions about what matters and how do we get there. I think this quote does a really nice job of highlighting where these different groups, these different actors can kind of butt their heads against each other. But this individual says you want to plant fringe trees and other stuff, and they're not available, and they're not available because nobody specifies them, and nobody specifies them because they're not available. It's the same catch-22, right? So having opportunities for collaboration, communication, education can hopefully address some of these types of challenges that are maybe a little bit less harder to overcome than issues with the plants not being available in the first place. I also want to just briefly highlight some of the things that came up around the use of natives and cultivars, since those seem to be really big discussion points. In this case, one participant said that all the jurisdictions are trying to get 90%, if not 100% native trees. And so just, this awareness of the challenge of, native trees can offer a lot of benefits, especially from a conservation standpoint, right? It's hard to support native taxa when you don't have native plant material. But being aware that at times this can be restrictive and limit the opportunity to focus on diversification, out of a prioritization of just a few species that are native. So in this case, this respondent said, we have a list of about 12 trees we plant, and it seems to be because we're limiting ourselves to purely native trees. Not saying there's a right or wrong here, but, just thinking about some of the nuance of what's my goal with my planting and where do I have room for potentially both of these different groups, native and non-native, to contribute. And it's a very similar deal when we look at cultivars, a strong interest right now in having straight species, and those are invaluable at, supporting landscape level genetic diversity in our populations. But then also just thinking about the potential role that certain cultivars can play, especially as it relates to, pest tolerance for abiotic stress, and to the extent that our goal might be having a sustainable outcome, where does it make sense that if we can avoid having to, provide extra care or provide insecticide or pesticide treatments, maybe there's room for both cultivars and straight species in these types of discussions going forward there. So when we think about how we get here, the framework that I really like, and I don't suspect this is going to be a brand new novel idea to anybody here, but it's this idea of selecting underutilized members of the community. And so this comes from a white paper that Deb, Andrew, and Robert put out. You can find this online. It's held by the University of Florida website, so you shouldn't have an issue finding it. Normally what I like to do is go through, they outline a really nice 7-8 step process to prioritize underutilized species, right? So really focusing on what is not well represented, how can we incorporate more of that with the goal of incorporating or increasing urban forest biodiversity. And so for them, underutilized is less than 1% of a population. So that's a pretty small number to have. But it's definitely not a number that I think is insurmountable to try to work towards. And so just to give an example, I'm going to, not pick on Philly, but Philly's great because they have a lot of their tree inventory data publicly available. So it's easy to pull it, easy to sort through when trying to come up with examples. And this is what their top 10 general looked like, at least as of a couple of years ago. And so we can look at this. There's no, really no value judgment. I don't think it's good or bad. It's just, it is what it is here. What you'll notice right away, everything is compliant with Santamore's 10-20-30 rule. There's nothing, at least at this level, that's more than 20%. But is that good? Is it not? Well, if, our friend from earlier were to make an appearance where maples and sycamores and plane trees are two of the common hosts, next thing you know, we know about 30% of this population at least is going to be vulnerable to this unpredictable new causal agent of destruction that could come on in. So that's not great. But another way we could look at it a little bit more charitably, the top 10 account for about 70% of all the plant material, which means that the other 30% is all around 2% or lower. So if you bump that up, change the numbers a little bit, you could say that, anything that's less than 3% is about 35% of the population. That's pretty cool, right? That suggests that there's a lot of diversity down there that's not super well represented and could be used or thought of or put in place of some of our more top heavy individuals like Acer, like Platanus, if the goal is strictly diversification. The trade-off there is that the goal in many places is to put trees that'll grow. And we know that there's many great individuals that are from the Acer group that grow really well in urban spaces. So it just requires thinking about what the primary goal and endpoint are. And that's not to pick on Philly. Other places have problems too, where they have bottlenecks, especially with Acer, especially in the eastern half of the country. We look at Toledo, where almost 60% of street trees are maples, right? So opportunities for changing that as we go forward. I will gently and lovingly poke on Austin. I did this similar exercise there a couple years ago, and here we saw southern live oaks were 15% of the population, same with cedar elms. So at that case, an individual species really, really highly represented just creates opportunities for diversification going forward. I'm getting to the end here, but a huge point for what we need to do step 2, right? Tree inventories, I can't stress enough. I think I'd have a lot of agreement here, but the value in having current, updated tree inventories, not just to know what's there, but to begin to understand where we see patterns in diversity, bottlenecks in diversity, and allow us to kind of design things going forward. You can't do that if you don't know what's on the ground. So can't speak to the importance of having that tool available. And so I'll wrap up here with this idea going forward of really trying to think about, again, I apologize, kind of jargony, but this idea of strategic diversification to support urban forest multifunctionality. That's a mouthful. But this idea of intentional and goal-oriented diversification efforts that are really in line with thinking about what functions are important. Usually there's more than one. This is a 5, 10, maybe 15 different functions that we see being provided by these trees here. And knowing that sometimes we don't get every single function, by pursuing one goal relating to maybe, increasing forest cover or what have you. So, when I think about some of the common goals that we look at, increasing canopy coverage, promoting resilience, enhancing ecosystem services, these are great goals. These are things to strive for, but it's not always a guarantee that the pursuit of one of these is going to be in line with the pursuit of all of them. Sometimes they can be at odds with one another. And I'll just give this example to kind of wrap things up here, but we think a lot and we talk a lot about how large trees are great in cities. They provide a ton of canopy cover. If you're tracking changes in canopy, that's great. That's a lot of biomass. That's a lot of photosynthesis. So there's a lot of benefits there. But if we think about this other aspect of diversification we talked about, structural complexity or vegetation complexity, just a really nice paper looking at 3 different park environments, one that's very simple in vegetational complexity, and then getting up to a much more complex environment down here at the bottom. It's not hard to imagine a world where you could have comparable levels of canopy cover in these different environments, but the one in the bottom, right, where canopy is perhaps identical depending on the scale, has all of this understory material, right? It might be a better habitat depending on the organisms you're focusing on, bird populations, pollinators, what have you. And so in a world where we have finite resources and finite budgets, do you focus on canopy cover? Do you focus on promoting the structural complexity for the benefits it will entail? It really just depends on your goals, your outcomes, and your objectives. So I'm going to skip through this just to wrap up. And I'll leave with this idea that these are great goals to strive for. But sometimes they can be at odds when we have finite budgets. And so really being clear about what goals you want to prioritize and knowing that there may be different strategies to get there, I think would be one of my big takeaways moving forward. So I'll leave you with this ancient crisp proverb: the best time to diversify your landscape was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. And with that, I will thank you for your virtual attention. And I guess with whatever time I have left, I'm happy to take any questions. But again, that's my email. Feel free to reach out if you want to continue the conversation offline. So thanks a lot.
Well, thanks, Dr. Riley. That was awesome. Really appreciate your time here. If you have questions, we have a few minutes, so please drop them in the chat or use the Q&A feature here in Teams. And wow, I started in urban forestry 12 years ago. I'd never planted a tree before. I think they wondered why they hired me at Trees Forever. And so I just soaked everything in. And we were in the middle of emerald ash borer crisis here in Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
And that 10, 20, 30 rule was just preached to us. And as a new urban forester, I learned it and I was like, that's it. So this is just something that I have repeated over and over. And
Sure.
It hasn't been until recent years that people have said, well, what's the real science based on that? What's it really entail? And so you opened our eyes to that. And then just giving names to this different type of diversity. So lots of different trees are good. That's diversity. And then age diversity might be 2 things that I would pair it. But the idea of structural diversity, I think, is really helpful for people to think about. There's more ways to do this in their communities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Leslie, I almost think sometimes with the 10, 20, 30 rule, you can almost look at it as like a willingness to pay rule. If you're faced with losing 5% of your trees, is the idea of either removal or ongoing management, is that a cost you can stomach? And once you find that threshold, that really keys you in on what your max level may be for a given species or genus or even family.
Yeah. Well, I noticed that you went past the native, non-native slide very quickly.
Yeah.
So many of our communities are dealing with that of pressure from residents here in Iowa, the prairie folk, because we are a prairie state, push us very hard for native only. In Iowa, where I live, Doug Tallamy has been here many, many times talking about native species. I wonder, we do have a few minutes. I think this might be important because I hear this a lot from our community members and our members. So what do you say to those people who are getting pressure from the bird people or the bug people of native only?
Yeah, I do not take, I actually removed a slide that might be good to share here. I don't take the same stance of natives only. I feel like that can be a little bit too restrictive. I think it can rule out, plant material that might otherwise be really well suited to a site. Now, there's a lot of factors to consider. I would never promote something that has a history of being invasive. I wouldn't recommend a non-native maple if you have 18% maples in your population. But there's this interesting trade-off that I don't know if it's always kind of acutely uh, discussed, where a lot of folks want, native plant material, and one of the results of might be really palatable to a lot of our native consumers. And so you may end up having plant material that gets defoliated. It may have issues. And that's fine. If your goal is conservation, then that might be a trade-off you're willing to pursue. But if you want, more pristine or less pest-prone material that you would end up treating with a material, a pesticide, or what have you, then it doesn't really make sense to focus and limit your tools to just what is native. You may find a non-native plant that's maybe less from a conservation standpoint, but very, urban hardy or very pest resistant. And that might be better suited to the landscape that you're working in. So I think it really just depends. But yeah, my general view is that the native, non-native can be a little too reductionist. And there's a number of papers, I go with the entomological side. I'm less familiar with some of, say, the avian community research, but how likely a non-native plant is to be fed upon is oftentimes a product of the community it's surrounded with, right? So it may not just be a fixed trait of that plant, but it may be a product of what is around it and what are the things feeding on it in the first place. So long-winded answer, I don't subscribe to a native-only policy, and I think there's good room for strategic incorporation of non-native plant material depending on broader goals and objectives there.
We have a question. Would you agree when people say that the urban environment is not truly native given the soil and local environmental changes?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good observation. What is native is kind of a fundamental philosophical question, but how much should we focus on conservation efforts in urban, highly modified systems relative to maybe having other tree-related ecosystem services like cooling, stormwater runoff, things that may be more suited towards helping people living in these spaces.
Yeah. And I really loved thinking about that structural complexity. It never had come to my mind in that way. And I'm curious, we don't have to go in too much, but some of that plant material underneath can be really important for native insects. So if this is what I've heard, that if they fall from the tree, then they're not on grass or on pavement, and there's something else to support them as they might go back into the tree. And so that could be another way to be thinking about benefiting native species and native insects that ultimately help the birds. So it might not be just focusing on, oh, well, the folks in my community want native only, helping them think about the levels that we need to have in our community. If we can fit it in, you had a great photo of a very urban environment still fitting in that layers of material.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with that more, that when you think about it from more of a habitat standpoint than just an individual plant standpoint, there's a lot of room to get creative there.
Yeah. The CEU form is in the chat if you're seeking ISA CEUs. And someone asked if you have a favorite tree. Are you willing to put it out there for us?
I'm not a big favorite person. I know that's such a cop-out answer. I don't have a favorite bug. Yeah, I don't really have a favorite tree, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
Okay, maybe offline some other time we'll get
Sure,
into it more.
Yeah.
As a jargon-loving person, would you agree that in a highly disturbed setting, such as a city, we may need to adapt a reconciliation ecology stance?
Yeah, sorry, what?
Go ahead. I wondered if you understood the question. It's in the chat if you need to read it.
Yeah, let me make sure I'm clear on what is being asked here.
So it's under Patrick there.
I appreciate your jargon-loving sense, Patrick. We may need to adapt to reconciliation ecology. Yeah, I would agree with that, Patrick. And I know that gets quickly to being a deeper conversation than what we maybe have bandwidth for. But yeah, I would agree. And I think one of the challenges, as opposed to restoration, I think one of the challenges really gets to the fact that we have so many different people that have different ideas for what an urban ecosystem should look like, should have. And then we also have, really good intentions that can flow in that are focused on more of let's restore it to a native space. And that's just not feasible, again, given finite resources in many cases. So yeah, I would agree with that a reconciliation approach is probably more appropriate. But it's hard to paint with too broad of a brush when it comes to urban systems as a whole.
Yeah. Well, we are at the top of the hour. Jose, I see your hand up. I think we could bring you off mute here. And if you need to drop off, do you have just a few more minutes?
Yeah, I can hang out.
Okay. Jose, I've allowed Mike if you want to ask a question. It'd be an accidental hand raise. Well, we'll start wrapping up here. And Dr. Riley, you shared that the paper from Dr. Kozer and team, we actually had one of their researchers on a couple of years ago about widening the funnel and this idea of why we have this issue about trying to get a wide mix of species. And we've all inherited the problems from the people above us. And so all the way up to the nursery grower and the researchers who decide what trees are going to go to the nursery. So I think I can get that recording here and share it after if anyone would like to see that, because it's very eye-opening and thinking about as a funnel that you've inherited this thing at the very bottom, what's gone into it to achieve that is really eye-opening too. So we'll wrap here. Thank you for your time. If you are a member, we really appreciate having you a member of UCFS. If you're not a member, we hope you'll join when the time is right, and we'll look to see you next month. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.